Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'm so excited. I get to share with you the My Monthly Superhero Kit for March 2026 from Hero Arts. There's two different kits that you can choose from. You can choose the My Monthly Hero, or you can expand that and choose the My Monthly Superhero. The My Monthly Hero includes a stamp and die set, as well as that Holy Cow stencil, a milk carton die set, and then 10 sheets of cardstock that are 5.5 inches by 8.5 inches. If you want to expand it to the Superhero Kit, that includes the first kit, plus the spilled milk stamp and die set, as well as the milk and cookies die set, and then a milk carton layering stencil. So as you can tell, this month's kits have a dairy theme. It's called Milk It, and I'm going to be creating 4 cards total. The first 2 are using just products from the My Monthly Hero Kit. The last 2 cards use products from both kits or the expanded Superhero Kit. So I'm going to be using the color palette based on the colors of cardstock that are in the My Monthly Hero Kit. The only other color of cardstock that I'm adding is white cardstock for my card bases. To start off with, I used my Infinity Ovals die set from Hero Arts to create some ovals for mats around some of my images. It gives it a little bit of a background that's a little bit more interesting than just trimming them down to rectangles with a trimmer. So I chose 2 different sizes. I had 2 larger sizes picked out at the beginning, but I wanted to use both pieces of this cardstock frame created with the pomegranate cardstock. So that way one of my cards can have the oval as a mat around a white oval, which is going to be my first card. The next one, we're going to use the frame or the negative space that was cut out of it, and we're going to create a frame around our image just so that we utilize our cardstock in the best possible way. For our milk carton for this card, I'm using that milk carton die set, and I used the alabaster cardstock to die cut it. I wanted a nice light color. I'm ink blending around the outside edges with some scattered straw distress ink just to give it a little bit of visual dimension. I have those pieces on my sticky mat, and I'm just using a large blending brush. Now there's 2 different tops that you can pick and choose for the milk carton. You can either have it closed or you can have it open. So I love the fact that there are those 2 options, and you can pick and choose which look that you're going for. For the die cut detail on the side of the box, I have some windy cardstock here, die cut, and I'm just ink blending it lightly with some faded jeans distress ink. Again, just to give it a little bit of visual dimension. You could leave the ink blending out of it, but I do think it just adds some more interest to the pieces. I have a smaller oval from my pomegranate oval that I cut white cardstock from, and I'm doing a little bit of ink blending with that faded jeans distress ink. Just going to tie those blues together. And I'm being light-handed with that because I do want to stamp a sentiment on here, and I don't want it to be completely covered with blue. If I wanted that background blue, I would have die cut some blue cardstock, but I like the look of white cardstock behind my die cuts. It just gives it a little bit more contrast. I'm going to stamp a sentiment using the stamp and die set from the My Monthly Hero Kit, but I haven't used this set before. So the very first thing I do when I have a new clear stamp set is I use a white eraser on the stamping surface and then a brush to brush off any eraser bits. It just helps that stamp to take ink just a little bit better, and I only do this one time, the very first time I use the set, and I do the entire set so that I know if I've used one stamp that set is done. I don't have to do it again. So I choose my sentiment stamp, and there's also a little cow in there, well actually cow head in there that I'm going to stamp as well. I'm going to use the excess cardstock from cutting my oval, might as well use that up. These have matching dies to them, so once I'm done stamping them, I am going to match up the dies to them, and I'm going to die cut them. For the cow head, I stamp that with some black Soot distress ink, and then for my sentiment, I'm stamping it with some Lumberjack Plaid distress ink. So the cardstock that is included in here is poppy, pomegranate, Bellini, beeswax, saffron, windy celestial, alabaster, truffle, and raven. So we've got some reds, blues, yellows, as well as brown and black. So that's where my color palette comes from. You could easily swap out for completely different colors, but I wanted to use the colors that were in the kit for the colors for these projects. So once I have these stamped, I can clean my stamps off. I'm just using dye-based ink, so I can clean it off with a damp cloth. I don't need any special cleaner. And that milk carton, that die cut that I have lightly ink blended, I'm going to stamp some stripes on the side of it. This is one of the stamps included in the stamp set, and I thought it would add some nice detail. Even though this is the side that has those blue die cuts, I thought we would have the red underneath there and then the blue die cuts on top. They're just going to add a little bit of extra interest, a little bit of extra detail, but those are things that you could leave out if you want. I want to do one more thing to my milk carton, so I'm leaving it in my Misty stamping tool. That way, when I have my sentiment here die cut, I can glue it right onto the milk carton and stamp a couple more details with that sentiment in place to make sure that I have those details stamped in the proper position, if you will. I'm using a little bit of Best Ever craft tape to hold my dies down while I'm die cutting them. That way my dies are not going to move on me, and I run them through my Platinum 6 machine. And those pieces of Best Ever craft tape, I just reuse them over and over again. I can get 5, 6, 7 uses out of them until they really don't stick too much anymore. So we might as well use them as much as possible. So with those details done, I can glue my sentiment to my milk carton. Now I could have stamped that sentiment directly to the milk carton, but I wanted to stamp it on a white piece of cardstock and die cut it so that I had some white outline on there. It just makes it stick out a little bit more from that die cut milk carton, as well as the fact that it gives it a little bit of extra texture and dimension. So there are some little curved lines that I thought would look nice on top and below that sentiment. So that's why I wanted to glue my sentiment in place. I didn't want a chance that I would place it on there, stamp those pieces, and it wouldn't be exactly how I wanted it. So I glued the sentiment down first, and then I position those stamps for those little curve marks and then stamp them. And I stamped those with some Faded Jeans Distress ink. So with that done, we're ready to start assembling the rest of our milk carton and then assembling our card. So we have these 2 little blue strips that go on top of these, or go on the side of that milk carton. I want to position them so we see as much or the same amount of those stripes on the bottom and on the top, just to make it nice and even. And just like with most of my projects, I'm using some Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle. This works perfectly for teeny tiny die cuts, like you'll see in a moment with me doing some chocolate chips, as well as larger die cuts. I use it for gluing most of my projects together. It sticks really well, and by using liquid glue, it gives you that little bit of wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place. There's a lot of sentiments on this stamp set, so I decided to choose one to put it on the inside of the card, and I stamped that with some Lumberjack Plaid Distress ink. The nice thing about stamping on the inside of the card, when I position that stamp, there's a grid on the Misty stamping tool, so I can make sure that it's stamped straight on there. So I do, after positioning my stamp, I do take a look at that sentiment on the grid on the Misty to make sure that it is straight. Now I'm ready to put the front of my card together. So I glued down those 2 ovals, and then I'm just going to position that carton of milk in the center of it. Now I could easily have just done rectangles on the background, and that would have looked totally fine as well. I just think the oval in the background kind of frames it a little bit and highlights that milk carton a little bit. So I glue down the bottom of the carton, and then I can glue down the top 2 pieces. So for this one with the milk carton open, there's 2 layers to that top part. For the one with the milk carton closed, there's just 1 layer to it. But I love, again, the fact that you can pick and choose which one works best for you. And then I just put the cow stamp and die cut to the top of the carton. Now I wanted to color in some of the details for that cow, so I used Tombow marker number 528 to color in the collar, then number 723 to color his little nose, and then number 991 to color in his horn. So the blue and the yellow are inspired from the colors from the kit, and then the pink is just for the nose of the cow. It's not actually colors in the kit, but it didn't really make sense to do that in any other color. And then lastly, he's got a little bell on his collar, so I just used a silver gel pen in order to color that to give it a little bit of a metallic touch. So a very simple card, but I love all the texture from all of that the different die cuts for this. So next we're ready to create a card using that milk and cookies die in the My Monthly Hero set. So I have them die cut out of alabaster cardstock as well as truffle cardstock. For the little cream in the cream filled cookies, I used whatever ink was left on my brush from the Scattered Straw ink, and then I just added a little bit of color to the outside of that die cut, or at least the outside of the die cut that's going to be visible. The back part is going to be covered by a cookie, so I didn't bother with that, but it's just going to give it a little bit more visual dimension as well. Then we can glue those 3 layers together to create those cookies, and again, using that same Burlap art glue, gluing them all together, and then I just put them underneath an acrylic block just to hold everything nice and flat. It frees up my hands for working with other things, but it makes sure that those glue or those die cuts are adhering to each other and staying nice and flat as that glue dries. So once I have these ready to go, I can just do a little bit of ink blending on my cup here. I decided I thought it would look good to be chocolate milk, but I didn't really want to have a upper layer to the top of my chocolate milk. You could die cut another glass and then use that as a guideline for the top of it. I decided just to do the bottom of the cup and kind of get an ombre finish to it. I wanted to have a little bit more visual interest than just a plain cardstock color. Now, this is the leftover piece from the oval from my last card that I was talking about earlier when I was cutting those ovals out. I'm going to use this as a frame on this card. To give it a little bit of extra interest, I'm using that Holy Cow stencil with some Frayed Burlap Distress ink. This is the same color Distress ink I used on the cup just a moment ago. And I'm just stenciling in the detail from that cow print frame. Now I'm focusing that ink on the outside of the frame. So the inside of the frame, you might see a tiny little bit of ink with that cow print, but it's going to be mostly just that pomegranate color rather than the cow print. Now, obviously I could also have done black for the cow print. However, I opted not to because there's not really black anywhere else on this card. So I opted to keep it with just that Frayed Burlap, the brown ink that I was using. So I have my cup here as well as my cream-filled cookies that I'm going to be using on the bottom left side of this card. I want to have a sentiment on my background, so I chose the 2 sentiments here and positioned them on the background. So we have 2 words here. One is the large one that says Legen-Dairy, and then the small one says You Are. So the You Are, I am going to stamp in that Frayed Burlap Distress ink. The Legen-Dairy, I'm going to stamp and emboss it with Lumberjack Plaid Distress Glaze, just so that it gives it a little bit of dimension as well as some shine. It gives the card just a little bit more texture than having it stamped flat. You could easily just use the Lumberjack Plaid Distress ink in order to stamp it, but again, I always love the combination or giving cards just a little bit of extra texture. So I positioned those both at the same time so that I knew that they were both placed where I wanted them to be. I just used that Frayed Burlap ink on the You Are part of the stamp. Then I cleaned it off and removed it, and now I'm ready to stamp and emboss the Legen-Dairy. So I used a little bit of embossing powder tool on my background and then stamped it with some Versamark ink. Then I will remove it from the Misty Stamping Tool and we'll pour that Lumberjack Plaid glaze over top of it. Now I just think it's funny that this whole this whole kit has a milk theme to it, and I'm lactose intolerant, but I do really miss milk, so it's really great to play with milk and milk themed products and not have the bellyache from lactose intolerance. So this was a really fun kit to play with, and I just love all the colors that were included in the cardstock in the kit. So once I have that sentiment stamped and embossed, I'm ready to add that frame around it. So my white piece of cardstock there was trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. It doesn't really matter what size. I just wanted it slightly smaller than my frame. My frame was trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches before cutting that oval out of it. When I glued down my sentiment, there's just a little sliver on the top left corner of that frame that peeked out there. So before gluing it down to my card, I just did use my shears to just trim that little slip of paper off of there so that it wasn't visible on the front of the card. Then I'm ready to position my cup as well as my cookies on the front of the card, and I'm doing that overlapping that frame. If you wanted, you could put it behind the frame and have the frame overlap the whole thing, but I kind of like the look of the frame on the background and then the cookies as well as the glass just in the foreground. In my opinion, it just gives it a little bit more interest to it. So I'm gluing that with that same glue throughout the whole thing, positioning them. So when it comes to putting those cookies down, because I use that liquid glue, I can move them around a little bit and adjust them to it so I have them positioned exactly how I want. Then I put that acrylic block on there and hold that down while that glue dries. And now we're ready to start working on our next card. So on the next card here, I'm going to be using that milk and cookies die set again. That cookies, or the cookies in the die set, have a few different options. So I chose the sandwich cookies for the last card, and for this one I'm using some chocolate chip cookies. So I use that alabaster cardstock for the cookie base, and then I use the truffle cardstock for the chocolate chips, using a little pickup tool in order to pick up those die cuts to place them on that cookie. Now I opted to do this on a mostly white background, but you could easily swap out the cookies for the sandwich cookies. When you see the card finished, you could easily take the sandwich cookies from the last card and put it onto this one here, because this card here has a really light look to it, because we've got the pomegranate cardstock, the red accents with mostly white cardstock, and then that alabaster cardstock for the cookies as well as the cup. For this one here, I opted to just do whatever ink was left on my brown brush instead of adding more ink to it, just to add a bit of visual dimension but not change the color of the cup. So this one is fairly light, and the last card was fairly dark-ish around the outside of the card. So easy enough to swap pieces back and forth if you're wanting just a little bit of a different look. I have the little straw here from the cup, die cut out of some windy cardstock as well as celestial cardstock, and then use that glue to glue those pieces together. The great thing about that straw is it leaves little impressions or little lines showing you exactly where the different divisions of the different areas go. Then I used the ink blending brush from my Faded Jeans pad just to do a little bit of ink blending around the straw. While I was talking, I did the ink blending around the cup with whatever was left on my brush from the Faded Jeans pad. I inserted that straw into the tip of the cup and then added a little bit of glue to the background just to secure it in place before I am going to do my sentiment here. So I'm going to use my sentiment from the spilled milk stamping cup from the My Monthly Superhero Kit. So just like that first stamp set, I haven't used this one yet, so I used a white eraser on the stamping surface and then a brush to remove any eraser bits. And again, this only needs to be done one time. I don't need to do this again. There's a great sentiment in here that says, "You're the milk to my cookie. We make a great combo." And I just thought that was perfect to go with this milk and cookies die set. Now I don't have my oval die cut yet, but I want to make sure that I have my sentiment placed where I wanted it to go. So I just used that die placed on the cardstock in order to stamp and emboss that image before die cutting it. It's much easier to stamp and emboss using the Misty's tool on a rectangle or square piece of cardstock rather than die cutting it as an oval and then doing it. Sometimes you don't get it nice and straight on there. So I did it this way first, and then once I have it embossed, I'm going to die cut that oval. So I stamped it with the Versamark ink, poured that Lumberjack Plaid Distress Glaze on top of there. There was a little clump on there, so I just used my tweezers to remove that before heat embossing it. And you want to do that anytime your embossing powder isn't exactly where you want it to. You want to clean it up before melting it if you happen to have any grains of embossing powder stuck to somewhere you don't want it to be. You definitely want to use a soft brush and remove that first. Now I'm ready to add my die, and I'm going to use those pieces of Best Ever Craft tape in order to keep my die in place while I'm doing that die cutting. For this piece, once I have it die cut, I'm once again going to do a little bit of ink blending with my brown brush. And again, I'm not going to add any extra color to it. I'm just going to use whatever color is left on that brush. This way we get a really, really soft look. I don't want to change the color of that white cardstock. I just want to frame it in a little bit. Echo the ink blending that is on the cookie as well as the cup with my mat here, but have it really, really light and really, really soft. Once I have that ink on there, I can glue that to the matte part of my card. And that was once again die cut with that pomegranate cardstock. Now this kit has pomegranate as well as poppy cardstock. Poppy is more of an orange red, a little bit brighter. And then the pomegranate is a little bit more of a blue red or just a little bit darker. So it goes really well with that Lumberjack Plaid Distress ink. So once I have those two pieces glued together, I can glue that to my card base, and then we're ready to add the milk and the cookies die cuts. Now I want to add a little bit of extra texture to my cookies once they're done. So what I'm going to do is just add some glossy accents right on top of those chocolate chips. It's just going to give them some domed glossy dimension, and it doesn't change the color of the cardstock underneath them at all. When you first put the glossy accents on, they have a little bit of a milky finish, a little bit of a white haze to it, but as it dries, it goes completely clear. So it's a great way to add some texture and some dimension to die cuts without adding extra color to it. So with that on there, I'll set that aside to dry completely off screen. So we'll see it at the end of the video once that's all completely dried. For my last card, I'm going to use the milk carton layering stencil set. So this layering stencil set has two different milk carton choices on there. And just like the die set, you can choose whether the milk carton is open or whether it's closed. I want to use the sentiment from the Spilled Milk Stamp and Cut set that says it's okay to cry over spilled milk. So I wanted my carton to be open, so I opted for that one. I'm using my sticky mat here, and I like to put a piece of, or a couple pieces of painter's tape at the top left corner as well as the bottom right corner in order to just help position each one of those layers a little bit easier. And then I'm using just a scrap piece of printer paper to cover any parts of my stencil that or of my background paper that is not covered. This way, when I'm doing my ink blending, I don't have to be quite as careful. I know that I'm not going to accidentally get ink where I don't want it to go. And I just reuse those pieces over and over till I am done this particular project or till it has too much ink on the cardstock. So once I have that first layer done, I can lift that up and then I can position that second layer, and it's as easy as matching up that corner of the stencil in the top left and the corner of the stencil in the bottom right. I also have a couple extra pieces of tape just to hold that stencil down properly, simply because the top or the bottom side as well as the right side only has about a 1/4 inch of the stencil over top of that sticky mat, so it's not enough for it to hold. So those pieces of painter tape really help that. For this layer here, I use that scattered straw distress ink and then a little bit of the Faded Jeans distress ink on the center part of the carton. For that first layer, I just used the scattered straw. I added a little bit of whatever ink was left on my Frayed Burlap distress brush just to give it a little bit of a brown tone to it, to some of the layers, so that it has a little bit of a two-tone with those layers that have that scattered straw there. I didn't want to add too many colors to the base part of that milk carton. So by adding just a little bit of that Frayed Burlap, we just get some of those edges. They're highlighted just a little bit better. With this layer here, once I have some of those details done, I went and moved my scrap paper inside because I want those two pieces on the front of the carton to be in that Lumberjack plaid, but I didn't want to accidentally get it onto the side of the carton. So I used the scrap paper to mask that open part of the stencil off to make sure I didn't get any red in that area. Now we're ready for the last layer. This layer, or this stencil set, has 4 different layers to it. So the last layer here I'm going to do with that Frayed Burlap distress ink, just filling in those 2 kind of stripes around the outside part of the carton. And then after doing that, I'm going to put some clear embossing powder on the milk carton, basically. So I want to do some embossing of the spilled milk on my surface, but I don't want that white embossing powder to stick anywhere on my milk carton. So by putting clear embossing powder on the milk carton, it's going to stick to any area that ink is still wet. It ends up being only those 2 last areas that I did the brown ink to. If you don't want that embossing powder on there, you could easily just use your heat tool and dry that ink. Make sure it's nice and dry before adding the white powder to the spilled milk. But I kind of like the look of that clear embossing powder over top of that brown ink, just in that area, giving that milk carton a little bit of extra texture. It just gives it a little bit more texture, a little bit more interest. There's not a lot of embossing powder on there. It's a really thin amount, but it adds just a touch of gloss as well as that little kind of orange peel finish to those areas of the milk carton. Then we're ready to add the spilled milk on our surface. So there's a few different sizes of splotches here that we can use. I chose 2 of them. I'm going to put one in place first, and then I'm going to add the second one. So I'm going to use my Misty stamping tool to stamp the Versamark ink on here, make sure that I have it stamped clearly. So I will use a little bit of embossing powder tool on my back surface, and then I will stamp it a couple times with the Versamark ink, make sure that I have a nice puddle of that Versamark ink, if you will, or splotch or whatever. And then I will use the smaller stamp and stamp that as well. So we can emboss both of them with that white embossing powder. You could just choose one little puddle of milk here, but I thought the two looked a little bit better. When I did that second one, I tried to make sure that it wasn't overlapping the corner of, or the edges of my milk carton. So it just looks like it's on the surface that the milk carton is looking at or is sitting on. Now, obviously, when I'm doing white embossing powder on a white background, you really don't see it very well. So I will be doing some ink blending on that background in order for that to show just a little bit better. So like I said before, there's two different sentiments I'm putting on this milk carton. One says it's okay to cry over, and then the large one there says spilled milk. I thought it would be fun to put that on the front of that milk carton, and I am going to use that white embossing powder again. Now this, if you wanted, could have been done at the same time as the milk puddle. I find though, if I stamp too many stamps and do too much embossing at once, that I tend to mess things up, where I'm focused on one area, not as much on the other. So I did this in 2 stages so that I can make sure that I had those little blobs of spilled milk how I wanted them, and now I can pay attention to the sentiment and make sure that I have that the way I want it. I don't miss something on there. So with that done, we can start to trim this down. I have a mat cut from Celestial cardstock that is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. My stenciled and embossed piece here, I'm trimming that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And now I'm going to put this on my sticky mat and do a little bit of ink blending. So I'm going to use the faded jeans at the bottom of this piece here. And you can see right away, as soon as I do that, the spilled milk on my surface comes or appears. That ink is only going to stick to the cardstock. It's not going to stick to the embossing powder. So that white embossing powder finally shows on that white cardstock because we ink blended the background of it. Then I'm going to do a little tiny bit of frayed burlap just around the upper edges. I kind of thought it looked a little bit odd not having any ink blending there, so I just put a touch of it around there just to give it a little bit of dimension. Now I'm going to add a sentiment to the inside of the card. So this one here, it just says better days ahead. I thought that went well with the sentiment on the front. Now I could, if I wanted, heat emboss it with that Lumberjack Plaid Distress Glaze. I opted to just use the Distress Pad. I don't really often like doing heat embossing on the inside of the card. Sometimes when you're doing the heat embossing, it warps the cardstock a little bit. So I typically will just use plain ink on the inside of cards, or if I really want it to be embossed on the inside of the card, I will do it on a separate piece and then do a separate mat with it. For me, that ends up working a little bit better. So for this card, I chose to use the blue cardstock as the mat around my image here, only because it was different from the other ones. I didn't necessarily want them all to be exactly the same with their mats, but you could easily swap this for the pomegranate cardstock for the mat around it. I think that would look fantastic as well. Once we have those layers together, I put the acrylic block on there just to hold that for just a few moments while that glue sets. And here is the finished card. It's a very simple design. I love the detail that that layering stencil gives that milk carton, and then the extra bit of dimension from the white embossing for both the sentiment as well as our spilled milk on the surface. And then we have our sentiment on the inside of that card as well that coordinates with it. Then we have the You're the Milk to My Cookie. We make a great combination card. And again, I think the ovals in the background just add a little bit of extra interest to it, but you could easily just use trimmer and trim them down to rectangles if you want, or if you want a little bit more surface there. Then we have the You Are Legendary with the frame that was stenciled with that Holy Cow stencil, as well as our very first card using that milk carton die set. And I love the extra dimension that you get with the die cuts and with the extra sentiment and cow die cut on the front as well. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. You'll find all the products that I used listed and linked down in the description below. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I really appreciate it. Have a fantastic day.